So, good morning, everyone. It's my great pleasure to welcome you today. And thank you for being part of the GEF Global Biodiversity Framework Early Action Plan, Early Action Support Project. Welcome to this fourth webinar in our series of capacity building on integrating human rights and gender considerations into episodes. So my name is Yune. I am currently heading the Gender and Safeguard Unit in UNEP, and I also work as a safeguard advisor in UNEP. So briefly on the housekeeping issue, here are some brief logistic reminders. So if you have any technical issues with the connection, please send a private Zoom message to Alexis Legigand or email him at alexis.legigand@undp.org. You see that? And he's standing by to resolve any trouble you may have. But please do not use the group chat for that. So your microphone will be muted to ensure our speakers can be heard clearly. Also, we encourage your active participation during the question and answer session. So you have options. So to ask your questions, you can type your questions in the Zoom chat box as they come in during the presentation or during the question and answer sessions. Or you can virtually raise your hands, and the control panel will then ask you to open your microphone during the question and answer sessions. We will open a question and answer session after all 4 presentations are over to ensure that we allow sufficient time to hear from all 4 presenters. Finally, we have a webinar webpage where you can access today's presentations and the recordings. We'll also share them by email after this series concludes. So, on today's agenda, so we will start with a brief presentation of the human rights and gender elements of the EAS project, which will be presented by Christina Supples. She is a senior project manager at UNDP. And then we'll follow with integrating gender considerations into MBSUBs by Catherine Despo Belmonte, Senior Program Officer of UNEP at WCMC. And then we'll go further into human rights, discussing adapting human rights approach to MBSUB revision by Benjamin Schachter. He's a human rights officer at Office of UN High Commissioner for Human Rights. Then the last speaker will be Terence Hay-Eddy, who will talk about incorporating considerations of local actions and a whole of society approach. So then we will have about 20+ minutes, hopefully, to have a question and answer session. So let's start with a brief overview of the human rights element of the EAS project by Christina Supples, Senior Program Project Manager at UNDP. She will extract relevant Kunming Montreal GBF that calls for human rights and gender perspectives for meaningful MBSUB planning and implementation. Over to you, Christina.
Hi, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are. Thank you for joining us today for this important webinar. My name is Maria Marigo. I'm a capacity building and biodiversity senior officer. I am based here in New York City. And at the time that you're seeing this recording, I am in the middle of my night. And therefore, we decided that I would do this recording. And then if you have any questions, my colleagues will take them and then I can respond to them via the webinars page. So let's get started. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm going to stop my video and share my screen with the presentation, and we will dive into this important topic. All right. So let's get started. The idea today is that I'm going to provide a brief overview of the elements, of the human rights elements for this early action support project. In its opening statement, the CBD's Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework recognizes biodiversity as fundamental to human well-being, a healthy planet, and an economic prosperity for all people, including for living well and balanced and in harmony with Mother Earth. Today, we'll hear a lot about the way human rights elements are integrated throughout the framework and how it impacts our work on the Early Action Support Project. But before we dive into the detail, I want to emphasize that human rights considerations are embedded in our work in many other key ways. Target number 1 of the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework calls for conservation measures to respect the rights of Indigenous peoples. Target 22 calls for ensuring full, equitable, inclusive, effective, and gender-responsive representation and participation in decision-making and access to justice and information related to biodiversity. And Target 23 of the CBD Gender Plan of Action also aim to ensure gender equality in the implementation of the framework through a gender-responsive approach where all women and girls have equal opportunities and capacity to contribute to the 3 objectives of the Convention. CBD Decision 15/4 emphasizes that the successful implementation of the framework will depend on ensuring gender equality and empowerment of women and girls and on reducing inequalities. So around the time of the GBF adoption, there was a global coalescence around the human rights to a healthy environment. The GBF acknowledgement of the human rights to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment is also recognized in more than 150 countries and by the General Assembly Resolution 76/300 and a Human Rights Council's Resolution 48/13. In October 2021, the Human Rights Council recognized for the first time that having a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment is a human right. Not far after that, in July 2022, the United Nations General Assembly recognized for the first time the human right to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment and affirmed this requires the full implementation of the multilateral environmental agreement under the principles of international environmental law. There are also some regional agreements that you might know that exist, such as the 2018 Escazú Agreement, the first environmental treaty of Latin America and the Caribbean that aims to protect the right of every person of present and future generations to live in a healthy environment and sustainable development. Each party commits to ensure this right as well as any other right related to universally recognized human rights. One thing that these agreements have in common is the recognition that the exercise of human rights, including the right to seek, to receive, and to impart information, to participate effectively in the conduct of government and public affairs, is vital to the protection of a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment. There is an important nexus here. So now that you have a little bit of the context in which we operate, I will briefly orient you to key human rights elements of the Early Action Support Project. The project provides technical and financial support to the GEF-eligible parties to implement the GBF gender and human rights vision across all components. For that, there are 2 primary activities. First, it's stakeholder engagement using the whole of government and the whole of society approach. And then second is the gender action plan. These concepts are integrated throughout the 4 project components, as I'm going to show you. The Early Action Support project provides guidance and capacity building for parties on, stakeholder engagement, on social and environmental screening principles and procedures, and it also offers a mechanism for grievance redress. The project, and it's very important, considers the involvement of all key stakeholders, including Indigenous peoples and local communities. We often call them IPLCs. The rights knowledge and including, traditional knowledge associated with biodiversity, innovation, and practices of Indigenous peoples and local community must be respected. The NBSAPs will require future projects to apply social and environmental safeguards to ensure that all risks on Indigenous peoples and local communities are mitigated. So what you see on the screen are examples of stakeholders that could be engaged in this process. It's important to note that that list is not exhaustive, and any additional stakeholder might be relevant for some countries, of course. The stakeholder engagement process should start always with the CBD national focal point, the national focal points for the 2 CBD protocols, the GEF operational focal point, and the NBSAP responsible authority. And then it can be expanded to include a broader range of stakeholders, always using this whole of government / whole of society approach. So these stakeholders could be the finance ministry, the environment ministry, subnational government entities, research and academic bodies. It can be IPLC organization. It could be body representing agricultural, forestry, fishing, other sectors. It could be NGOs. It could be women organization. It could be an entity working on poverty eradication. It could be educators, media, youth group. And again, I'm insisting on this whole of society approach that is very important to the new framework. In the case of the Early Action Support project specifically, the stakeholders could be part of a steering committee that supports and monitor the implementation of the EAS project over time. And such a steering committee could be strengthened over time and used again for upcoming projects in link with biodiversity. Another key aspect of human rights is gender mainstreaming. UN Women defines gender mainstreaming as, I'm quoting, the process of assessing gendered implications for women and men of any planned action, including legislation, policies, or programs in all areas at all levels. The successful implementation of the GBF will depend on ensuring gender equality and empowerment of women and girls, and on reducing inequalities. When the gender lens is not adopted, it's important to understand we do not account for the knowledge and contribution of both women and men, which results in several missed opportunities and limited achievement in national and global goals. Gender is not a women problem. It is a mean to achieve better goals more efficiently with longer positive effects for both women and men. So it's an everyone's problem. The project will provide guidance to parties on how to ensure a gender responsive and socially inclusive approach, including recommendation for the inclusion of women and women's groups. The project's framework includes a gender action plan with gender-sensitive indicators for each component. The gender action plan supports women's participation and the targeted integration of gender equality considerations into the work under the EAS project and in the GBF Gender Plan of Action. What you see on the screen are examples of gender-responsive output indicators. So for instance, it could be ensuring that relevant women's groups and ministries are engaged in an inclusive whole of government approach, or again, that ensuring that gender equality considerations are mainstream into the policy alignment. More specifically, what you see on the screens are the indicators and the targets from the gender action plan that is part of this early action support project. So you know now that there are 4 components in this project, and for each component, we developed indicators and targets. So let's look, for instance, at component 1, which focuses on a rapid review of NBSAP alignment within the post-2020 GBF. This component is compulsory for everyone, and we have 3 indicators with 3 associated targets that are developed. So for instance, the first indicator is that relevant women's groups and ministries are engaged in an inclusive whole of government approach. The target associated is that an appropriate number of women and women's groups are engaged in a whole of government approach. We left this target a little bit open because we recognize that the gender mainstreaming process is different from a country to another, and that an appropriate number of women and women's group might vary from a country to another. And we want to give the flexibility and the freedom to the countries to mainstream gender as best as they can, recognizing their national context. In opposition, though, if you look at the last indicator, we have key participants participate in trainings and capacity building activities on gender mainstreaming, with a target of 40% of key participants that are made aware on gender equality, women's empowerment, and leadership in a context of NBSAPs. So here we have a target that is a little bit more objective and easy to implement. We ask for 40% of the key participants that are aware of gender equality and mainstreaming. When we look at component number 2, focusing on assessing the monitoring systems in the country, here too we have 2 indicators with associated targets. In terms of indicators, we want to ensure that the gaps in gender responsive biodiversity data and monitoring system are identified, and that there are opportunities to improve the gender responsiveness of the monitoring system that are identified too. Meaning that the assessment of existing gaps should show and should use sex disaggregated data and produce sex disaggregated data, and the plans for enhancing monitoring system should be gender responsive. When it comes to component 3 on policy and institutional alignment and the coherence with the GBF, same, we have 2 indicators, and again, we mentioned that relevant women's group and ministries and technical experts on gender mainstreaming are engaged through the inclusive whole of government approach. We also encourage that women and gender equality considerations are mainstreamed into the policy alignment processes. Again, here you can see that the first target is open. An appropriate number of women and women's group are engaged, again, to give the countries the flexibility to reflect the national context. And the second target is that the rapid review process is gender mainstreamed and action for policy alignment are gender responsive. Last but not least, on the component 4 on biodiversity finance activities, there are almost identical indicators and targets as with component 3, except that it's for biodiversity finance, so that, you know, an appropriate number of women and women's group and focal point on gender are involved in activities around biodiversity finance, and that the biodiversity finance activities incorporate gender considerations. In addition to the gender action plan, we have tools to help you in the project implementation, starting with publications. So we have a publication that will be launched in October by our team at UNDP, titled Gender Equality, Women's Empowerment and Leadership in National Biodiversity Planning and Reporting, where we provide support and recommendation on how to systematically mainstream gender through entry points, especially when it comes to preparing, designing, and writing your NBSAP. In the meantime, the Global Gender and Environment Outlook from UNEP is already available, and we strongly recommend that you have a look at it. We will make it available on the webinar webpage. In terms of capacity building, we will prepare a MOOC on gender equity, equality, and women's empowerment. And we had recently a webinar on stakeholder engagement using a whole of government and gender approach. We will have more content around that coming shortly. In terms of guidance and tools, we have developed an attendance tracker for gender disaggregated data that we'll be happy to share with you as well, so you can track the participation of both women and men in national meetings. We also have checklists and guidance on social and environmental safeguards and stakeholder inclusion. Our team is working on this, and it will be released in the coming weeks. And we also have a full guidance on gender equality and women's empowerment in the NBSAP development. Initially, we had prepared this guidance in 2017, 2018, and we're updating it right now to reflect the adoption of the new framework. So I know I am not here with you right now, and therefore the Q&A session is a little bit limited, But if you have any question, you can reach out to my colleague Christina Supples. I can also ask Cassandra and my colleagues to put my name and my email address in the chat. If you have any questions, please ask the team, and we'll make sure that we respond to your questions by sharing the responses again on the webinar webpage. With that, thank you so much for your attention. I'll turn over to my colleague, and I hope you have a productive session. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Maya. So let me introduce Maya again. Maya Garnier is the instructional designer at UNDP, a global program on nature and development. Thank you very much. So she laid out a foundation on the rationale to integrate the human rights and gender into EPISAPs with very useful tools and publications for you to explore more. So if you have any questions, please raise your hand or add your questions into chat. Remember that at the end, we will have an open discussion session where you can ask additional questions and discuss. And after the session, we will upload a document with the questions and responses from the experts on the webinar webpage. No questions? Okay. Since you have another opportunity to do that, let's continue with the next presentation on integrating gender considerations into EPISAPs by Catherine Despo Belmonte, Senior Program Officer of UNEP WCMC. Following Christina and Maya's overview, Catherine will delve further into the gender aspect. Over to you, Catherine.
Thank you, Yuna. Thank you for the introduction, and let's get started. Next slide, please. So in this session, we'll explore practical ways for integrating gender equality considerations in EPISAPs. Marion already provided us an overview, so perhaps we're going to go quickly through the mandate for integrating gender equality in EPISAPs for decisions that were adopted at CBD COP15. And then the content of this presentation is based on guidance and available resources that all countries have access to in the CBD website. This session will only provide an overview of what's available and suggestions for countries. Next slide, please. Yeah, and the next slide. So Section C of the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework, Decision 15/14, highlights that the successful implementation of the framework will depend on ensuring gender equality and empowerment of women and girls and on reducing inequalities. And as Marion already highlighted, the framework includes 2 gender-specific targets, Target 23 and Target 22. Next slide, please. Other key decisions related to gender equality that were adopted at CBD COP15 were the Gender Plan of Action, Decision 15/11, and the Enhanced Multidimensional Approach for Planning, Monitoring, Reporting, and Review, Decision 15/6. In this decision, parties are encouraged to apply the Gender Plan of Action in all aspects and at all scales of planning, implementation, reporting, and review related to the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework, and these include EPISAPs. Next slide, please. And then Decision 15/11, the Gender Plan of Actions, provides specific actions that relate to EPISAPs. And here on this slide, you have a few of the key things that are suggested as indicative actions for parties to apply at the national level. Next slide, please. In this slide, we have an overview of what a gender-responsive EPISAP would look like and what would need to be included. And we'll go through each one of these points in detail. Next slide, please. So we'll start with the national strategy, including both the process and the content. Next slide. So the first step is to consider institutional structures and capacities at the national level. And in this slide, we have a non-exhaustive list of entities and individuals that can help to ensure that the process and the content of the national strategy is gender responsive and in alignment with other national gender-related policies. It is important to plan for gender balance in meetings, workshops, and this means the equal representation of women and men in the different bodies, consultations, workshops that are developed for the national strategy. Next slide, please. The next step in the NBSAP from a gender perspective is to conduct a gender-responsive stock-taking and assessment. This will help to reveal existing inequalities between men and women in the relationship with the components of biodiversity and bring into the focus the perspective, knowledge, and the different roles of women and men. Therefore, if possible, it would be important to include data and information in this assessment that is disaggregated by sex. And this slide includes a non-exhaustive list of the types of data and information that could be included in the stock-taking and assessment. Next slide, please. And after the stocktake, the next step is to conduct a gender-responsive participatory process for the development of the national strategy. And this will help to better understand the kind of activities that are carried out by women, the needs and interests from women, and their knowledge. Next slide. Marian already provided us an overview of a whole of society approach. And in this slide, we can see a non-exhaustive list of key stakeholders that should be involved in the process of developing the national strategy. And as you can see, this list includes representation from government, NGOs, CSOs, academia, relevant organizations, and also the private sector. But I want to highlight that something new is the Gender Plan of Action decision that was adopted at CBD COP15 has an action for governments to have a CBD gender biodiversity focal point. And this person should be involved in the development on the NBSAPs. Next slide, please. These are guiding questions to assess gender-responsive participation in the development of the national strategy. As previously discussed, it is important to have gender balance and to identify relevant stakeholders. However, having women in the room won't necessarily ensure their effective participation. For example, some women may find it difficult to speak out in front of male relatives or colleagues, or might not be willing to discuss issues in public. It is also important to remember that household duties and childcare are often assigned to women, which could make it difficult for them to participate in meetings. Therefore, participatory techniques require equity measures that can help to ensure gender-responsive participation. For example, this would mean preparation of activities in advance, the provision of training to women if needed, the provision of childcare assistance and transport, and also designing an enabling environment where women can speak. So the role of the facilitator in meetings is key to ensure that diverse stakeholders can present their views and participate in the discussions based on what is appropriate at the local and national level. For example, in Nepal and New Ireland, separate groups were organized for women and for men to ensure their effective participation, and this information fed into the NBSAP process. Next slide, please. These guiding questions might be useful to consider for regional workshops. Again, this relates to ensuring that relevant stakeholders are involved, that equity measures are in place, and that the views from the diverse stakeholders are reflected in the text of the document. Next slide, please. And this slide just provides an overview of what would be expected to be included in the final strategy if the steps outlined were followed from a gender perspective. Next slide, please. So now we'll have a look at the action plan. So in the process of developing the action plan, it is important to ensure that gender experts are included in the planning team, that women needs and interests are reflected when setting priorities for the action plan, making gender equality a prerequisite for programs and projects, ensuring gender responsive stakeholder participation, gender balance in project staff, and the allocation of financial resources for addressing issues and activities related to gender equality. Next slide, please. In terms of the content, these are some of the things that should be considered when developing the content of the action plan. Firstly, to include actions that will help to achieve Target 23 and Target 22 of the Global Biodiversity Framework. And gender equality should be reflected in the context, in the activities, and also identifying the relevant institutions at the national level that will help with implementation. Also, considerations regarding timeframes and budgets for these activities need to be included in the action plan. Next slide, please. Again, from a gender perspective, it will be important that gender objectives and actions that have been reflected in the MBSAPs are monitored and reported on. And this may require adapting monitoring systems to ensure that the collection of sex disaggregated data and the development of use of gender-specific indicators are done. This issue of monitoring and gender responsiveness in terms of monitoring systems and indicators is a component from the Yearly Action Support Projects component 2. So some of these things will be covered in the project. Next slide, please. So from the expected outcomes from following and developing a gender responsive MBSAPs are some of these, as we can see on the slide. With the aim to empower and position women as agents of change. So the expected outcomes include the provision of capacity building for women, activities to address gender equality within sectorial strategies, progress towards the achievement of Target 23 and Target 22 of the Global Biodiversity Framework, equal participation and representation of women and men in decision-making processes at all levels, and the revision, if possible, discriminatory laws, for example, related to land tenure. And hopefully women and men will benefit equally from the activities and programs that are delivered as part of the MBSAP process. Next slide, please. As noted earlier, this presentation tried to summarize key information from documents and guidance that is currently available on the CBD website. And we invite you to read and review these documents for further information and for best practices from countries that are championing gender responsiveness. Next slide, please. And these are the contact details from the team if you have any questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Catherine, for a very practical approach toward the gender integration in the MBSAP and some tips based on your extensive experience. And if you have any questions, please raise your hand or write on the chat. If there is none, then let's go to the next one. So next presentation is going to be on adopting a human rights-based approach to MBSAP revision. That will be presented by Benjamin Schuster. He is a human rights officer at the Office of the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights. He will guide the participants on how human rights are important for sustainability of healthy biodiversity and provide some practical steps through human rights-based approach. Over to you, Benjamin.
Thank you very much. First of all, I'd like to thank the Early Action Support Team for organizing and the invitation to join you all here today. You've already heard some good information about human rights-based approaches and gender mainstreaming in the context of national biodiversity strategies and action plans. I will be focusing on the human rights element, but I want to be very clear that when we talk about human rights, gender equality is a human right. So when we're talking about rights-based approaches, we're including within that umbrella gender responsiveness and mainstreaming gender equality. And you've heard already an excellent presentation going into details and specifics about how to do that, and very supportive of that important work. Next slide, please. I want to start things off with a quote from the High Commissioner, emphasizing exactly how important this is. The triple planetary crisis of climate change, biodiversity loss, and pollution constitute the biggest threat to humankind we have ever seen, imperiling our very survival and that of future generations. You can't understate how true this is. You can't overstate how true this is. The risk that environmental harms pose, and that of course includes biodiversity loss, which we'll be focusing on in this presentation too today. But it's important to note those three crises are interlinked, and they interact and affect each other. And we have, as was presented earlier, a framework and a roadmap for addressing these crises, and that is human rights and the right to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment, which includes a number of elements, including a safe and stable climate, healthy ecosystems and biodiversity, a non-toxic environment, clean air, water, food, and then participation, access to information, and access to justice in environmental matters. So we'll touch upon most of these issues, although not in depth in the interest of time. Next slide, please. So first of all, I just referenced the right to a healthy environment, biodiversity being a key component of that. Biodiversity is what we all depend on for a broad range for the effective enjoyment of a broad range of human rights, including the rights to life, health, culture, development, non-discrimination, adequate food and water. And the linkages between human rights and biodiversity are clearly recognized within the coming Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework, within ongoing work on Article 8J, for example, and throughout the deliberations of the Conference of the Parties to the Convention on Biological Diversity. Next slide, please. Here we highlight some of the specific rights that are affected by biodiversity loss. Please bear in mind this is not an exhaustive list, and rights are interdependent and indivisible. So this is a sampling. Life, health, food, safe drinking water, clean, healthy, and sustainable environment, cultural rights, the right to housing, the right to adequate standard of living, the right to self-determination, and the right to development. The important thing here when we start talking about human rights-based approaches and the fact that biodiversity loss impacts the effective enjoyment of these different rights is that states have an obligation, a legally binding obligation, to respect, protect, and fulfill human rights, including by preventing foreseeable harms from things like biodiversity loss or other forms of environmental degradation. Next slide, please. The office has conducted an analysis. So now thinking about national biodiversity strategies and action plans more specifically, the office has conducted an analysis of the integration of human rights in national biodiversity strategies and action plans, essentially through 2021. We looked at the current MBSAPs for each of the states, and that analysis unfortunately revealed that few states were making explicit or direct references to human rights in their MBSAPs, that the majority of MBSAPs did sometimes factor in human rights related issues through indirect references, but as a whole, they failed to adequately integrate human rights and to expressly articulate in human rights language the entitlements of rights holders and the obligations of duty bearers. This is significant because using the explicit language of human rights makes it clear that we're talking about legally binding obligations, and enables us to bring the full force of the human rights framework and the human rights-based approach to bear in advancing the MBSAPs and advancing accountability for human rights harms caused by biodiversity loss. Next slide, please. Based on our analysis, we decided to develop guidance on integrating human rights in national biodiversity strategies and action plans. We did that guidance in collaboration with the UN Environment Management Group, Issue Management Group on Human Rights and the Environment. So this was a UN system collaborative effort. The guidance was submitted for informational purposes to the Secretariat of the Convention on Biological Diversity in advance of CBD COP15. We are now in the midst of finalizing a peer review process of the guidance, which has been facilitated by the CBD Secretariat, and hope to issue an updated version in the coming days or months, but relatively soon. Purposes of this guidance are to support UN country teams, states, and policymakers in integrating human rights in MBSAPs and clarify how human rights can be integrated alongside capacity building and peer support. The guidance is available on the EMG, IMG website, OHCHR's website, and the new version will be made available as soon as possible. Next slide, please. I'm going to skip this one for the most part. I think it's been fairly well covered, but just to flag in particular, language in section C on considerations for implementation of the coming Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework refers to a human rights-based approach, respecting, protecting, promoting, and fulfilling human rights, and rights of indigenous peoples, gender equality, right to development, the right to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment, among others. The specific targets adopted in the Global Biodiversity Framework, or a number of them, specifically reference human rights and gender equality as well. I think that's been fairly well covered by the previous presenters. So, next slide. I'm going to pass on this one in the interest of time. Next slide. So, next slide as well, just in terms of moving forward. So in terms of the development and elaboration of MBSAPs, the guidance we've provided includes a number of general recommendations that would help integrate human rights in MBSAPs, and it also delves into a number of specific issues. And another thing it does, which is important, right, is it talks about how the MBSAP itself is created. And that needs to be through a participatory and inclusive process. You don't get good results unless you include the people affected by biodiversity loss, the rights holders that need to have a voice in the process. And that's borne out not just by by me saying it, but by the work of the Intergovernmental Panel on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and essentially, there's both a legal obligation and a scientific consensus that this is good policy. So as a starting point, the MBSAPs that are being developed following the adoption of the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework should be developed through a participatory and inclusive process. This, we believe, will also lead to more effective integration of human rights in the substantive content of the MBSAPs. Next slide, please. So some examples of how to do this, how to explicitly integrate human rights in MBSAPs. One is to reference relevant international human rights obligations and domestic human rights laws. Another, to reflect the duty of the state to regulate effectively all public and private actors under its jurisdiction to prevent threats to human rights in the context of biodiversity loss. This one is particularly important and one of the key elements and reasons the human rights framework is so important in this context is that it deals with the obligations, not just of states, but also the responsibilities and duties of businesses and other actors. And particularly in the environmental context, this is absolutely critical. That the MBSAP should elaborate on efforts to respect, protect, and fulfill the human right to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment. That it should describe the human rights obligations of the state as a duty bearer and how they will be fulfilled through development and implementation of the MBSAP. Next slide, please. So I'm gonna pass through or skip some of the examples, but they're all there on the PowerPoint, and there's even more in the guidance. Here I just maybe highlight one, which is the duty to cooperate and mobilize resources. So the MBSAP should integrate that duty to cooperate and mobilize resources to address the harms caused by biodiversity and to ensure that those resources are mobilized in a way that benefit the people most affected by environmental harms. Next slide, please. As I said, it goes on to discuss a number of specific areas, MBSAPs and environmental governance being one of them. I already spoke a bit towards this when I was talking about the process for producing the MBSAP. Of course, the implementation, monitoring, and review of an MBSAP also needs to be participatory and inclusive. It should recognize the rights of Indigenous peoples as well, including for their free, prior, informed consent. It should reflect issues related to access to justice and access to information. Next slide, please. So biodiversity loss disproportionately impacts persons, groups, and peoples in vulnerable situations. Target 22 emphasizes of the GBF emphasizes access to information, participation, and access to justice for Indigenous peoples, local communities, women and girls, children and youth, and persons with disabilities. This is essentially integrating efforts to achieve Target 22 is a key way to address some of the ways that biodiversity loss disproportionately impacts the rights of people in vulnerable situations. MBSAP should think about and address historical and structural discrimination. They should prioritize action to protect biodiversity that also creates co-benefits for people in vulnerable situations. And they should recognize and protect the tenure and resource use of Indigenous peoples, local communities, women and girls, and others in vulnerable situations. Next slide, please. It's already spoken a bit to this. There are also a number of targets in the Kunming-Montreal GBF that explicitly relate to the rights of indigenous peoples, including with respect to land and resource tenure, traditional knowledge, participation, access to information, and access to justice. So this is a really important element, particularly given that indigenous peoples occupy and use a number of the lands, resources, and territories so critical for biodiversity protection and mega biodiverse areas. Next slide, please. So rights for children and youth. I want to flag here a very recent development. Yesterday, in fact, the Committee on the Rights of the Child issued its general comment number 26 on children's rights and the environment. The general comment clearly states that the Convention on the Rights of the Child protects the right to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment. And it goes into detail describing different elements of the right, including healthy ecosystems and biodiversity. And of course, Article 13 of the CBD addresses issues related to environmental education, which Article 30 of the CRC does as well. So there's an overlap that's important. And of course, there's also an ongoing discussion, not on children's rights, but on the rights of future generations that's important to reflect on in this context and space as well. Next slide, please. The protection of environmental rights defenders. I think this is fairly self-explanatory. We need to protect the people who are defending healthy ecosystems and biodiversity if we want to ensure better outcomes for the environment. Target 22 of the GBF makes this explicit by calling for protection of environmental human rights diversity, human rights defenders. And MBSAP should clearly reflect the obligation of and commitment by states to prevent killings, persecution, and harassment of environmental human rights defenders. Next slide, please. I spoke already to this, the need for MBSAPs to address the responsibilities of businesses and the obligation of states to effectively regulate businesses for human rights harms related to biodiversity loss and the impacts on the environment. Next slide, please. And then finally, implementation monitoring of the MBSAPs, which I spoke to a bit previously as well. It's really critical that there be participatory biodiversity planning, action, and monitoring, a transparent process for implementing MBSAPs and ensuring a continuous dialogue relating to the interrelationship between MBSAPs and human rights and the protection of the right to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment. Next slide. So that's it. Contact information and some other links there. Really grateful for the time. Happy to answer questions.
Thank you very much, Benjamin. Your presentation is very comprehensive, and the PowerPoint itself can be used as a resource material for any participants. I find it very useful. We are running late, so I will go straight to the next presentation, if that's okay. So let's continue with our last presentation by Terence Hay-Eddy. He is the program manager of Global ICCA Support Initiative. He will discuss how localized actions are important and promoting landscape approach as a powerful way to bring human rights and ecosystem restoration together. Over to you, Terence.
Thank you, Yune. Can you hear me?
Yes, very well. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much. So this webinar actually comes at a very good time. I'm just back from the GEF assembly, which was taking place in Vancouver last week, where many of the topics around the revision and update of NBSAPs were the focus of the discussion. One of the headline observations, of course, is that the NBSAP process must be brought to a level which is commensurate with the focus on the NDCs, with the climate change. If we could get the next slide up, please. And I'll talk a bit in this presentation about the relevant scale around the local action and the whole of society approach, including the national levels. But just to recap briefly what other speakers have already talked about, is that we've seen over the last 3 years this progressive buildup of focus around rights-based approaches in relation to what was known as the post-2020 GBF, now the Kunming-Montreal. And back in 2020, when the UN General Assembly met for the high-level summit on biodiversity, there was this focus on reimagining conservation in a very new way. So not only thinking about human rights as a do no harm approach, but really thinking of this as integral to the new GBF in terms of how conservation can be carried out. And we've seen now the GEF CEO, Carlos Manuel Rodriguez, emphasize heavily over the last week the involvement of social inclusivity as part of his vision, along with integration and impact to take us through to the year 2030. And so here you see some of the resources that were part of that advocacy towards the Montreal COP15. And this convergence around rights-based approaches, and Ben and others have given us a fairly detailed review of this. Next slide, please. And so we've heard about the two-step process of the right to a healthy, clean, and sustainable environment between the Human Rights Council and the General Assembly. We've heard about the guide that is soon to be finalized through the ENG, a collaboration of multiple UN agencies. Next slide, please. And we've heard a little bit about the intersecting mandates of the different UN special rapporteurs. So there are a number of them that touch upon this right to a healthy environment. So not limited just to the mandate of the special rapporteur on human rights and the environment, but the ones on toxics, on climate change, which is the most recent one, and others. And on the left, you can download that relatively recent information note that UNDP and UNEP and OHCHR prepared on the right to a healthy environment. Some say that this right to healthy environment is almost the meta level, which brings together many pre-existing rights that were there before. Next slide, please. And to recap what we heard right at the start from Marion, these are, again, the desirable target groups for the NBSAP process. So at a minimum, the group on the left, which include all of the different ministries with a direct responsibility for the environment, but also some that are impacting nature, but may not necessarily have yet been brought to the table. And then this wide range of non-state actors, which we've heard about, and also going beyond just the women's groups and the indigenous peoples, but also towards other sectors sometimes which would not necessarily be there. So the role of philanthropy and foundations, a whole wide range of actors in the private sector, which is not a single thing. It includes banks, includes different levels of pension funds, in insurance sector, finance sector. So as part of this webinar series, there will be other discussions, no doubt, around the work that UNDP is doing on biofin, on the biodiversity finance plans, which must intersect with this whole of society approach. And I'll talk a bit more about whole of society in terms of scale. Next slide, please. So Ben talked about the IP-BEST. This is very important precursor to the GBF in terms of its very systematic review of the literature around the most effective approach towards biodiversity conservation at a landscape or territorial scale. So it essentially concluded that human beings living with nature and contributing to nature and being part of nature is the most viable long-term strategy. So sharing the space with other species rather than just setting it aside. And we see this reflected in the GBF action plan, the agenda for nature and people. Next slide, please. So coming back to this question of scale, there are various ways this can be thought about in terms of connectivity, in terms of the size of habitats and ecosystems and watersheds. But fundamentally, it all comes back to the question of governance, that as human beings are relatively dominant across many landscapes, that these areas need to be thought as integral planning units, where the understanding of that particular landscape or seascape is please, Indira. Next slide, please. And so we don't have time to go into this, but this slide is essentially to show this fairly broad range of processes across the UN system, which touch upon landscape approaches. So some of them are within the CBD. We see this with in relation to work being done around the Global Landscapes Forum, UNU. I'll talk more about the guide that they have produced. The Satoyama Initiative, which takes us back to the 2010 Nagoya COP and the Aichi targets, but also across other UN processes. So within the UNCCD or the UN Decade on Restoration, there are a number of landscape-focused initiatives, AFRI 2000, the World Resources Institute, channeling support around that. And then under the UNFCCC for the LULUCF agenda, nature-based solutions, but also under the adaptation framework on locally led adaptation processes. Same thing with the Food System Summit and the GEF. So some of those resources will be made available. Next slide, please. And so I'll just say a few words specifically now about the guide that the UNU IAS have produced around landscape approaches, where it helps define what we mean by a landscape as a little bit like the IP-BEST, a mosaic of different land uses and systems, ecosystems and settlements. Next slide, please. And so this is the guide where you can download it on the left. There's an introductory video for it. It puts it into the context of the GBF right up to date this year. In the Substa last year, we had a side event around this topic with the government of the Netherlands, who've been very active around landscape approaches, and there's some resources there as well around this work on governance. Next slide, please. And so the UNU guide essentially steers focuses on the process to move towards space-based networking for collaboration, linking both urban and rural hinterlands. Next slide, please. And so here there are two slides on the stepwise process to build in the landscape or seascape approach into NBSAP. Some of it we've heard about in relation to gender in terms of identifying key stakeholders, goals, resources, starting with an initial first assessment and draft. Next slide, please. And then moving into the phase of, no, this one, thanks. So once NBSAPs are sufficiently evolved or have been updated, and of course there's a long history to this in many countries over the last 30 years, there's a need to move towards actual learning by doing through applying approaches with the different sectors in order to then have an iterative process of learning. And so the early action support process is one of those updates, but it has to be linked to continuous implementation, not just a theoretical set of targets. Next slide, please. So in the few minutes I've left, I'll just give you a few actual examples of implementation that is underway, well, that has been for the last 12 years by UNDP. This is one of the examples from the Nagoya process around the Satoyama initiative. So UNDP is now entering a fourth phase of implementation in 20 countries, looking at how socio-ecological production landscapes and seascapes, SEPLs, can be considered as a unit of analysis of landscapes and seascapes, and how they can be strengthened through a range of measures, one of them being direct local actions through small grants, but also other forms of assessment of key threats and strategies for those landscapes. And I'll just emphasize this because last week in the GEF Assembly, one of the areas that the CEO was talking a lot about was subnational action, and he himself has often championed this particular landscape approach in his home country in Costa Rica, given that very often it's actually at the subnational level that the whole of society approach is possible, where many of the different actors in the ministries and civil society and NGOs and so on actually meet and can find a meaningful level of interaction. Next slide, please. So yeah, within Comdex, the theory of change towards sustainability was around a number of the different elements. I won't go into them, but both connecting nature-based services, ecosystem services, with livelihoods and governance systems. Next slide, please. These are some of the examples of how that can be done, some of the indicators that were developed for those landscapes and seascapes, which would be very relevant in terms of the NBSAP monitoring element we heard about. Next slide, please. And then, so I think I only have 2 more slides left. So the important thing here, when we take the case of Ghana, which is one of the 20 countries, is that to achieve this landscape governance scale, at the national level, the stakeholders decided upon a particular landscape. You see it in the top left there in red, called the Weto landscape, to undertake a series of restoration and other conservation actions towards resilience. And that scale was deemed to be the most relevant one to achieve this whole of society approach. Let me just re-emphasize, for very large countries, clearly it's not easy to do a whole of society approach for countries, for example, like the size of India. There was a side event on how India is producing subnational NBSAPs. Other countries may focus on the landscape approach given the relevant scale involved. Next slide, please. I think it's my last slide. So just to wrap up, to say that under the GBF, we heard about the targets 22, 23 on gender and decision making. And we heard about target 1 on spatial planning, but essentially there's a 3-way triangular relationship between the 3 spatial targets, 1, 2, and 3. 1 being the spatial analysis, 3 being the spatial 30% by 2030, and the target 2 about the restoration being a pathway towards achieving some of that conservation and connectivity in the broader landscapes. And we've heard about the COP 14 decision around other effective area-based conservation measures. The SEPLs is one of those possible OECMs. There will be a number of other such area-based measures which deliver on biodiversity, which will be included. I think this is my last slide. Yeah, thank you very much, and I'm available for questions. Back to you, Yune.
Thank you very much, Terence. It's good to remember. It's a good idea to have landscape as the unit of analysis and bring the perspectives of human rights, gender, and ecosystem restoration. Okay, well, thank you very much. It was the last presentation. Now I want to open the floor for questions and discussions. So anyone who wants to come in, please raise your hand, and we will unmute so you can come in with your face or your voice. I can also propose some questions for participants to think about. What are the kind of experience you have as a challenge or opportunities of integrating gender and human rights into MBSAP if you are already working on it? And are there some anyone who would like to share the experience and challenges or some general kind of a perceived issues or any clarifications on that?
Maybe Yune, just one comment.
Mm-hmm.
From UNDP's perspective, as in relation to the 2030 SDGs, the leaving no one behind approach actually refers to an intersectional approach. So I think we need to bear in mind when we're talking about inclusion for gender, for indigenous peoples, for persons with disabilities, that these things intersect quite heavily. And so one of the challenges, in a sense, will be to monitor this range of intersections that take place around these different levels of remoteness, of vulnerabilities, and things like that.
That's quite interesting, yeah, because we are talking about intersectionalities, but then it's quite often we leave it for anyone's kind of individualized approach. So systematizing that would be helpful. So if there are no questions, comments from the participants, can I now ask presenters if you want to add anything after hearing from other presenters? Anything you want to add?
Well, for those participants that are part of the GEF Early Action Support, perhaps after this webinar, you can consider some priorities to address in this work and how this can support you with your MBSAP implementation, including all of the different topics that we've covered. I know that we provided a lot of resources and guidance, and I hope that with this webinar, at least you have a structure on pathways for approaching human rights based approaches and gender equality in your MBSAPs. And we're here to help if you have further questions. Thank you.
Thank you for that. Benjamin?
Yeah, really just to echo Catherine in the sense that OHCHR as well is happy to help and support the work to integrate human rights in national biodiversity strategies and action plans, in addition to the resources that I referenced in the presentation, and including the Environment Management Group, Issue Management Group, guidance on integrating rights and national biodiversity strategies and action plans. We have some other reference and resource materials about human rights and biodiversity the reality and the special rapporteurs, the environment and rights of indigenous peoples in particular have worked on quite extensively and addressed issues related to rights-based biodiversity action. And I think the reality is that the main challenge and barrier right now is partly resources, and then partly sort of expertise. And OHCHR can help with the expertise side of that. The resources piece is a little more challenging, but we're here to work on both.
Yeah, we at least have GEF funding to start. Thank you very much. We have 7 minutes left, but if there are no other comments or questions, we can close the session. So I want to thank everyone, and I want to thank particularly the presenters, so Marianne, Catherine, Benjamin, and Terence, for their excellent presentation. We had a chock full of resource we had within this 1.5 hours. I learned a lot from all of you. Thank you very much. And for further discussion, as some of you mentioned, the information is available, and you can reach out to global teams of UNEP WCMC, OHCHR, UNDP, or the Global Biodiversity Framework EAS project team. And there's an email that will be shared in the chat box. Yeah. So as you can find all the session recordings and presentations and the discussion afterward on the webinar web pages. That'll be available also. It'll be in the chat box as well. The upcoming webinar 5 will be in the week of 18 to 22 of September about the MBSAP target alignment and related tools and technical supports. And details on this will be shared via email soon. So we look forward to your participation to the remaining seminars, and thank you very much and have a great day. Bye, everyone.
Bye.